What's up, guys? My name is Josh Johnson. I go by the handle EmberRoot on all of my socials. I am a plant geneticist and horticulturalist by profession, and I've spent a lot of time investigating this market. And I wanted to bring up some key points that we should all keep in mind when we're discussing these shortfalls and these pitfalls when it comes to legislating cannabis and the pitfalls of breeding cannabis. If you grew up during the 90s or even the early 2000s, you probably remember when a gram of cannabis would smoke out a whole room. Just having it in the pack, you would smell it for ages. You probably remember the potency and the entourage effects that were associated with household names like Hindu Kush, cookies, Girl Scout cookies, etc. If you smoke today, you're probably questioning, why has the quality of cannabis decreased? Why is there so many unregulated shops popping up? What is going on with the recreational market, the medical market? Why is it so hard for us to get good quality flower like we did back in the 90s and in the early 2000s? I have some specific points to make, especially regarding my profession, which comes with genetics and plant breeding. And the first point is that cannabis breeders en masse don't know what they're doing. What I mean by they don't know what they're doing is that there's never really been a real structured breeding program for the benefit of cannabis flower. And the need for breeding programs in general comes apparent when you're dealing with a plant like cannabis. Cannabis is dioecious, meaning that there are male plants and there are female plants. Now, there are emasculating techniques and things that you can do to isolate parts of plants and then flip them to a different gender in some cases, especially using different PGRs. However, normally, cannabis is dioecious. Now, because it's dioecious and it's an obligate outcrosser, it's also incredibly heterozygous. Heterozygosity has to do with the fact that cannabis has multiple alleles for any given trait. That makes breeding programs incredibly challenging and complex in order to isolate a given trait or a given THC profile, for instance, or terpene profile. These breeding challenges, however, are not exclusive to cannabis. There are other high heterozygosity and other high dioecious obligate outcrosser plants that have been put through breeding programs, proper breeding programs. And the purpose of a proper breeding program is to ensure that when you sell seeds, those seeds are very much producing the same kind of morphological characteristics that you would expect from the mother plants. However, today, when it comes to buying seeds on the producer's side, very rarely are you going to come across a fully selfed line, selfing the plants, and therefore back crossing them and enhancing desirable traits into a seed that is morphologically very similar. That leads us to the conversation about the clonal market, which is the more popular way to spread varieties when it has to do with cannabis. That's the shortcut method that has been around since millennia. You'll grow a particular plant, it will produce a very pleasant experience, and then you'll take vegetative clones and then mass produce those. But this does not address the fact that there is no morphological synergy with the seed bank. So anytime that plant would produce seeds, every single seed is a different recombinant of the different genes, and therefore will have different effects, whether it be slightly or extreme in some cases, to the mother plant that they came from. So notoriously, cannabis breeders have been producing seed that is not true seed. It's not seed that is going to produce a morphological plant similar to that of the predecessors. So if you were to cross, we could just use two strains for an example. If you were to cross Hindu Kush with Northern Lights and produce a progeny, every single seed is an individual phenotype. And those individual phenotypes will then display different terpene profiles and different entourage effects. So there's no stability when it comes to producing clonal propagules through seed. It makes things incredibly hard for producers. So people that produce and grow cannabis are mainly producing things through clonal propagation, especially when they have like a hit strain. This also presents issues. Main issues being pest and disease prevalence, especially when in regards to hop latent viroid. In 2021, it was found that 90% of cannabis facilities that were being surveyed in California contained hop latent viroid infected hemp. and hop latent viroid infected cannabis flower. Issue across the industry, across countries. There were surveys done in Canada as well that also support findings that HLVD, hop latent viroid disease, is prevalent in a lot of the flower that is being produced nowadays, and that is largely due to clonal propagation, moving the disease from clone to clone. Done particularly by Dark Heart Nursery found that around 1 out of 3 plants in every single facility they tested positive for hop latent viroid, meaning there is significant viral pressures on the very plants that we're consuming. So before we even get into infrastructure and regulatory processes, the primary problem at play is the biology of breeding cannabis in the first place. The things that I mentioned before are minor compared to the fact that there has never been real investment into infrastructure by industry in order to create true inbred lines of seed for then producers and consumers to be able to attach real names and real variety to, which is where the colloquial name strain or flavor comes from, because they're not true varieties, they're not true inbred lines that can be reproduced. What does this mean for consumers and producers? Well, this means that the strains from way back in the day, or even in recent history in the 90s and the 2010s, they're gone. Without reliable breeding programs, without selfing them after multiple generations, without doing proper back crossing and proper hybrid development, we'll never see those plants in their exact morphologies ever again. That's just reality. What we can do here going forward is to put our favorite strains through real breeding programs. And this is something that's going on today, albeit not nearly enough. And that's largely due in part to the regulatory bodies and the legislature that's in place that is monopolizing the cannabis industry. Now that we've talked about the biological constraints of breeding cannabis and creating true hybrid lines, let's talk about the regulatory side of it and what's really keeping the infrastructure bogged down. You can't talk about the regulatory side of cannabis without first bringing up the 2018 Farm Bill, which is the main point of this entire overarching discussion about cannabis regulation. Original intention of the 2018 Farm Bill was to give producers access to legalized industrial hemp production. And this was extremely favorable to farmers, especially coming out of the tobacco crisis, where many farmers had to switch from industrial production of tobacco to some other means of being able to use their land. Bill legalized hemp production on the basis of requiring a 0.3% or lower of active delta-9 THC in its dried out form. It was beneficial to farmers because now they were able to get legal crop insurance for things like hemp and hemp production. However, it was a double-edged sword that allowed for the production of synthetic cannabinoids to also be produced and sold under the classification that they are hemp. This lack of foresight when creating this bill allowed for the rise of synthetic cannabinoids like D8, like D10, like HHC, and also what I don't see a lot of people talking about is synthetically derived THCA, which we can talk about later. After the 2018 Farm Bill goes into place, you have farmers taking on hemp production on the basis that they're being promised by industry that there is going to be enough people that utilize and need hemp, that the supply chain will be there to process massive amounts of hemp, because producers largely do not do their own processing. They send it to processing plants and then receive money for that. 2018 Farm Bill itself triggered a genuine boom in hemp production in Tennessee. However, at the same time, the genuine boom in CBD production and CBD sales simultaneously shot down the price of all biomass produced by hemp. So because so many people were getting into producing hemp and CBD for the basis of using CBD extracts and therefore creating Delta 8 and Delta 10, which is CBD is the precursor to Delta 8 and Delta 10 if you do not know, because of the manufacturing strain and the economic incentives that came with producing CBD over hemp, industrial hemp farmers were essentially pushed out of the market. And this led to a massive die-off in hemp production. So farmers that had switched from tobacco to hemp production are now being left and hung out to dry by the very producers that promised them dividends for growing these things, which put a huge strain on crop insurance companies at the time, which raised crop insurance for not only just hemp market, but also other markets as well under the same agencies. So simultaneously, while this botched rollout of hemp production and legalization of hemp production is being rolled out, which really ended up turning into legal CBD production. We are seeing states on the state level essentially monopolize and hand medical cannabis and recreational cannabis access to multi-state operating companies. Companies like Green Thumb, for example. Multi-state operators like Green Thumb Industries invested heavily into super PACs that supported things like the Trump administration due to the fact that they were promised hemp regulatory laws that would bog down medical and recreational cannabis laws in order to keep a thriving hemp market. If you haven't figured it out already, hemp as a lobby is antagonistic to recreational cannabis. And to go even further, medical cannabis is an antagonistic lobby towards recreational cannabis. And this is because these multi-state operators like Green Thumb, like Dixtro, they are able to invest into these lobbies and into these super PACs that then get them special privileges and special say-so on regulations and legislature that has to do with cannabis. What you end up with extremely tight regulations on cannabis that is not being produced by a mega corporation like Green Thumb through industries like Rise. And they do this by essentially pricing out small producers. They hand it over to mega corporations by way of high licensing fees, high oversight fees, and other regulatory issues that make it harder for small producers to even be able to get into the game, such as lack of processing plants, like we talked before with hemp production. Now comes the rise of the whole sticker shop movement. You see these different shops that are coming up in your non-legal state that are selling cannabis. Well, they're able to do this through the loopholes of the 2018 Farm Bill by essentially selling you what is marketed as hemp. However, there have been plenty of different Oracle studies done on these different sticker shops and even done in legal states that found that over 60% of these products were either mislabeled, not accurately labeled, or using synthetics in place of actual Delta-9 THC. Combine that with the fact that the law is actively incentivizing these places to not sell you Delta-9 THC. They're incentivized to sell you some other synthetic form of THC like Delta-8 or Delta-10 or HHC or some other isomerized version of cannabinoids that are not regulated by the Farm Bill. They're incentivized to do this, on top of the fact that it is economically lucrative. Delta-8, HHC, and in some cases THCA even, can be isomerized and synthesized from CBD. And in fact, there was an Oracle study that had also found that many of these flowers that are being produced are being essentially added and sprayed with additional THCA that was derived from a CBD isomerization process, the same process that produces Delta-8 THC. Now we're getting into a whole new conversation in which we should be looking at chemical constituents within the cannabis industry, because now we're not even dealing with natural cannabinoids, we're dealing with lab synthesized cannabinoids, which could have lab synthesization constituents like solvents and things that were not properly handled. There's no oversight for these things. Lack of oversight leads to studies, independent studies being done, and finding that the majority of plants are contaminated with both hop latent viroid, heavy metals, and then the flowers are also contaminated with synthetic cannabinoids that are being produced in mass from the CBD market. The reason there's no oversight is because these things were not explicitly regulated within the 2018 Farm Bill, and therefore there's lack of state infrastructure to couple with that has to do with these sticker shops and these other unlicensed places, because there's no requirement for licensure when you're selling things that are not covered by the Farm Bill, like D8 and HHC. Also, no regulation in advertising. You could easily sell Delta-8 and Delta-10 cannabis and market it as regular cannabis, and there would be no oversight and no penalties. Now, let's combine the fact that there are breeding problems, there are morphological problems that inhibit our ability to make accurate and true varieties. That's true. There are also regulatory elements and legislature in place that keeps infrastructure from being developed to address those problems. That is also true. But coupled with that, on top of that, we've also established that there is corporate interest in keeping cannabis bogged down, specifically in the alcohol lobby, but also the CBD lobby and the hemp lobby, to keep recreational and medical cannabis a bogged down, in the hands of corporate owners only industry. All of that plays into the downstream effects of creating the sticker shock problem, like we talked about, the lack of oversight, the lack of testing within these different facilities for the different issues that I brought up in this video. But lastly, and certainly not least, we have to talk about the morphology around growing cannabis. Cannabis is not only a highly nitrogenous requiring plant, meaning it requires lots of nitrogen input, but it's also a known bioaccumulator. And if you don't know what a bioaccumulator is, that's essentially a plant that uptakes all sorts of different constituents from the soil. It can include things like lead, cadmium, zinc. When things are grown in the field, as they are in hemp production, you could be exposing yourself to heavy metals. In fact, a University of Miami study looked at around 500 different CBD products and found that roughly 47% of them contained heavy metals, 47% of that being lead, 37% being arsenic, and around 8% being cadmium. This is a human health concern. And along with these heavy metals that could be in place, like I had mentioned before, it being a heavy nitrogen feeder requires heavy nitrogen inputs. And nitrogen in the form of plant food is nitrates. Nitrates are not healthy for humans. In fact, in other countries, we regulate the amount of nitrates that are present in edible foods like leafy greens. However, there's no oversight, even in the most robust oversight cannabis places, there's no oversight for nitrate content, which is a known problem for human health. Now, we're in a position where the genetic component weakens strain identity, so people cannot even really identify truly with any particular variety or product because they're never going to be the same. Coupled with that, the regulatory side of it didn't incentivize it. It actually de-incentivized it and incentivized the post-production of synthetic cannabinoids, which are then being marketed as legal hemp. Combine this with the fact that multi-state operators have been lobbying for years to monopolize and, more often than not, oligopolize the legal cannabis market. That pushes consumers and even producers to the illegal market, which is actively being incentivized by legislature to produce synthetics. And running alongside all of this, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome cases in which people are getting sick from using cannabis products, especially after the 2018 Farm Bill. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. I can't draw those conclusions for you, and I don't have any evidence to directly point to that. However, it's very concerning with the lack of oversight for all of the chemical constituents, the lack of oversight for the fact that synthetics are being pushed to the market en masse, the fact that there is no legislature to allow for your regular producers like farmers to get into the market. So you're only having bad actors at play, and that's an issue for all of us.